Start recording. I think it already was. So that'll be good for the transcript. Welcome, everyone. Okay, so I'm really excited about this series. This is step one in what we are hoping to be a year-long series. And by hoping, I'm pretty sure it will be because I've got it pretty planned out now. So this is going to be a year-long series in how we essentially apply ACT. So the first step in everybody's, client process is to do the assessment. So that's where we're starting today, is with the assessment process. So consider this the intake, if you will. And then we'll continue to move forward and throughout the year so that we can share some new insights into programming and supervision and caregiver support, and also just general how it applies to our code of ethics and all of that great stuff. So without further ado, we're going to keep on moving on. But if you have any questions, please feel free to chime in, raise your hand, come on, unmute yourself, go into the chat, whatever you feel comfortable with. And that works for us. And again, it's just great to see so many of you, and I'm happy to practice with everyone. So without going too much further, we are going to do just something that we'll do pretty frequently, and that's practicing what it is that we preach. So this is perfectly timed because my phone's ringing right now. So I'm going to mute. But when I mute, I want everybody to take a moment to pause. The sales call, so it's okay. That's why they immediately called my cell phone. Okay, so let's all pause. Let out that stale air. Breathe in some good air. Now let that air out again.
Not anymore. I would be in.
Let's work on that.
Cool. And then what I want you to do is just look up and notice some things that are around you. You don't have to say them out loud. You don't have to write them down. Just kind of notice. And then I want you to notice what's happening inside of your body. Did you notice a change from before you started taking a breath to now? Do you notice that maybe your shoulders are slightly less tense? Maybe you have released some of that tension in your jaw or between your forehead and your eyebrows. Maybe you've swallowed a little bit, right? All of these little things are ways that we can practice just slowing down so that we can start to engage in what's the present moment. And this is one of our first steps with ACT. A lot of people are actually really fluent with this, and it's pretty amazing to see them just kind of like own a space, right? But that's not always the case for a lot of us. A lot of us ruminate. A lot of us are worried about what's to come or what isn't happening, or several of us are worried about things that are currently happening that are yet out of our control. And then some of us are worried about things that have happened in the past, and we're just kind of ruminating on those types of things. So this is what just kind of stopping for a second can do for us, is bring us back into what we are in control of, which is something that behavior analysts love, and that's our environment. So that's what we're going to talk a lot about today too, is just how this still is very much behavior analytic in nature and those connections, because I know that's a lot of times where that disconnect comes from, right? Okay, so today our hope is to just kind of give you a basic understanding of the assessment process within ACT and some things that we can do there. But then also I'm going to give you just kind of a brief rundown of some terms that you're going to need to be familiar with, some of the literature review that our colleagues have provided for us. And then we're going to have some applications that we're going to be able to work through. So before we get started, does anybody have any questions? Okay, cool. Thanks so much, y'all. And again, feel free, just let yourselves be heard if you need to. Okay. So as I just mentioned, ACT is very behavior analytic in nature. It just seems like it isn't, because it does have a radical application, right? And many of our historical behavior analysts have very much been radical. And I will say that there was a shift in the 1970s, and that shift essentially set the model for where we are today, for better or for worse, right? But there were several who were still in that same generation who were very quietly shouting that maybe we still do need to consider inner behavior, or maybe those thoughts and feelings and emotions do matter. That's also inner behavior. So they were essentially not as loud as some other voices, right? So that's really pretty common still to this day, right? So we're going to go through just the basics. Before this is kind of like the preamble. So we have ABC before we get into our learning objectives of one, two, three. So our preamble today, our forward, if you will, what is ACT? Well, acceptance and commitment therapy. Many people have since coined it as acceptance and commitment training. I just have a problem with the word training unless we're talking about like training staff or training a dog. So that's just kind of my own thing. But I also understand how some people struggle with the application of the word therapy, especially because applied behavior analysis is often lumped into therapy. But if we go by definition, it's not necessarily. And that's something that y'all can look up in Cooper. It's in like the table. And yeah, anyway. Um, and then I would also say that it was not originally intended to fall into the framework within relational frame theory. It started off in verbal behavior. And then it very much once it was kind of easy to see that verbal behavior can easily fit also within relational frame theory, that this also worked because you're working through contexts, you're shifting through different frameworks that are essentially encouraging different verbal behaviors or different behavioral responses too. So along that same level, when we're talking about different contexts, that's essentially just when we're looking at different choices that can be made, right? The behavior of choice making. So this is what psychological flexibility essentially is, which is choosing to go one way or remain stagnant or to go a completely different way, right? One way that we were kind of exploring earlier was with that present moment and just getting our bodies aware and connected to what was also happening in the environment around us. So there's this essentially this connection, right, between our mind and our body and the environment. And that's all that present moment awareness is essentially trying to do, which is just establish or reestablish that connection. You'll also find that a lot of times that just kind of slows your breath down a little bit. It might help you relax just a little bit, right? So that was a choice that's rooted within psychological flexibility. Okay, awesome. And this is also reinforcement based. So we're going to go through this as a later part of our series, right? But that essentially means that it's pretty ethical and that it is using reinforcement based strategies first and exhausting those prior to using anything that might be more intrusive or restrictive. And when we think about values, that's really just another way to look at what reinforcement truly is, especially when we're looking at something over time. And values are essentially something that we look at over time based on what the behavior is that's happening before, right? That consequence or that antecedent, or excuse me, or so the behavior and then the consequence or the contingency, which was the word I was looking for. Okay, cool. So any questions about this just kind of basic thing of what is ACT? We're about to move into some keywords too, if that helps. Okay. Okay, so before we go into those keywords, we're going to go through the literature review because, again, people still are questioning, is this behavior analytic in nature? And yes, it is. It started in behavior analysis with Dr. Hayes, And it has very much, I think the reason why we find it difficult is because there haven't been a ton, there have been very recent ones, but there haven't been a ton of novel or replicated studies of using ACT with learners who are autistic or something of the neurodivergent umbrella outside of many of the mental health disorders, such as OCD or depression or anxiety. However, there is a growing body of these applications, which I think just kind of makes sense because we're going to go through again what some of this research has been outside of the field of autism. And then we'll go through what does our field currently say? What are some of the louder voices saying right now about ACT? And what are some of these more current applications within our field of application for the most part? And I'm making a pretty broad generalization because I think most people are utilizing ACT or utilizing ABA services within an autism application simply because, again, in the 1970s, that was pretty popular and was able to be capitalized upon pretty well, right? So here we are living within that model. So this is from Zettel in 2005, and this is really just a brief article. This is more of an opinion piece, if you will, but he does break down this specific thing, essentially about the history of ACT, which we were talking about earlier. So it started in the 1970s and 80s. It was a quieter voice. And it really talked about this extension of these verbal behavior approaches, right, that Skinner had given to us in the 1950s, as well as rule governed behavior in the 60s. And then really kind of switched a little bit in the 80s. And this was, again, as we were talking about, when RFT was starting to become popular. Part of the reason it was starting to become popular is because one of Dr. Hayes's colleagues was one of the ones who kind of had this theoretical thought. And they started really kind of approaching that with some different perspectives, right? So it makes sense as to why Dr. Hayes would then say, like, ooh, I could see now this RFT approach because he was essentially part of that process to begin with. And then now we are where we are right now. And this is what essentially has been referred to quite often as the third wave, right? The third wave of behavior change. I don't know if it's necessarily that so much as just how we probably should have always been practicing with providing a little bit more autonomy and choice making and reinforcing more intrinsic motivation as opposed to some more extrinsic, tangible reinforcements that I think we often rely upon as essentially a crutch so that we don't have to go so radical. But that's my opinion. Okay, so this again is not new stuff, but I wanted to talk about kind of why we talk about these things or why ACT might be essential for us, especially when we're talking about context and how things change when we're experiencing different contextual events. This is from really Gold Diamond, but previous to that, or this is from Lang, but previous to that, Gold Diamond had said this little parable essentially that we have highlighted here. It goes through a bear hunt, right? But it goes through all of these different feelings that this man, this hunter, is feeling. So this excitement and anticipation of I'm about to be on this hunt, right? To the fear of oh crap, I am now being hunted, to the anger of like fighting back, right? So this little parable, which if you can't see it very well, don't worry, I'm sharing the articles with you. So you'll have access to everything that we're talking about today. That way you can read this. And if you want to just say what page it's on page 1 and goes to page 2. So you're going to see it pretty quickly. But this is essentially just kind of like, oh, context does matter, just as the function matters too. And you're going to hear me talk about that a lot too, because really everything that we really do apply within our agency, we still take a function based or synthesized approach depending on the learner. Because again, some learners shift through these contexts really quickly. So that means that a synthesized reinforcement procedure might be more appropriate, right? Whereas others where we can say like, oh man, very rarely does it stray from this particular function. I'm going to make sure that most of my interventions are like very much like to this function, right? So those types of things. But when we're still talking about that, we still want to put this contextual approach to everything that we're talking about. So when I talk about context, I'm talking about current context as well as historical contexts. So one of the things that we also need to consider too, and this is just as a trauma-informed practice, is making sure that you're taking into consideration historic data as well. That way, what you're doing within this assessment process, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, is really providing you all of the information that you need to make a more informed decision based on the possible context that this learner might experience most frequently. Does that make sense? Because I feel like context alone is very RFT, which can sometimes be a little bit more difficult, a little more difficult to conceptualize. Okay, cool. Don't hesitate to ask questions, although we will have time at the end. Okay. And then this was really one of Dr. Hayes's earlier works. This is from the 90s. He's still doing a ton of work right now. So if you subscribe to any of the stuff that he's doing right now, I think he's doing a big sale for his ACT Immersion, which is a fantastic course. It's long, but I think that he's also even like putting in like one-on-one time with him, like mentorship time, and that could be a really cool opportunity because he's pretty fantastic. Um, but yeah, so I just want us to look at this one little thing under the heading that says acceptance and commitment therapy. And it says the essential goal of ACT is to treat emotional avoidance, excessive literal response and cognitive content, and the inability to keep commitments to behavior change. So that's very behavior analytic, right? We're talking about as experiential avoidance, which I think most of us can identify with. There's something that we were like, I'd rather avoid that altogether if I could, please. And our learners also have that same thing. That's where our compassion comes in, right? Which is, I don't want to do that either. And I can understand why you are not enjoying this experience either and would do anything to get out of this experience, right? So, from that scenario alone, we can see how ACT has a direct application to what it is that we're trying to do and accomplish, right? I think so. I'm nodding along for y'all, just assuming that y'all are nodding too. So we've talked a lot about different applications that there can be. But for me, this is one of the most powerful things to think about. And this is from the World Health Organization, and it's not new. I think this came out in 2020. I say this isn't new. That seems like that was yesterday, but it also seems like it was 15 years ago. So this is from 2020, and this is from the World Health Organization, which is basically, act that this is what you're supposed to do in times of stress. Again, this is provided for y'all, but it's also available on the World Wide Web for free on the World Health Organization's website, which is just under stress management and what you can do when you're feeling stressed. So, when we think about again experiential avoidance, I think that we can all identify that many of our learners, as well as ourselves, have experienced stress in some of these contexts within ABA sessions. So, could we also then potentially agree to how this could be applicable for ABA sessions in behavior analytic? I'm just nodding again for y'all. Cool. Here are our citations, which you can't see very well. So I'll again make sure that you can see those at the end in our references. But you'll get all of these articles, plus a few more that I thought I was going to include that I didn't end up including, but bonus. So you'll have those. And then each time I'm going to make sure that we share several things with y'all, just because I think resources are pretty valuable and they help us continue to grow our practices. Beautiful. Any questions about our literature review? Okay.
No, thank you.
Thank you for the feedback, Brittany. I truly appreciate that. Feel free, anybody else? Awesome. Thanks, Rose. And before I forget to, I'll make sure that I put it in the chat so that you'll have a direct link. I'll do that when we're doing our next little ACT exercise. Okay, so just some basic terms that you're gonna hear quite frequently throughout this assessment process. Values, we've already talked about that one quite a bit today. Committed action, that's what you're doing right now. You are engaged in an activity that's values-based. And the reason that I know that is because you're actually here, right? You're not doing something else. You would value that more if you valued spending time with your husband. Maybe he's with you right now, but you're also still attending this, or you would just be out there with him, right? So this is again just a committed action that you're engaging in right now. We were just talking about present moment awareness. That's where you're making that connection between your mind, your body, and the environment around you. That's ultimately our goal pretty much all the time, right? We're going to talk about how there are some things that matter that happened in the past or some things that we're looking forward to, right? But that's not necessarily what's happening currently. That's not something that we can change right now. But self as context is where we can play around with that. So that's where we're really going to talk about perspective taking. So the past perspective, the future perspective, someone else's perspective, which this is where most people struggle, which is not being able to identify with another person, which I think is possibly why we are often lacking with being able to immediately and fluently provide compassionate care. And that's because we lack the true empathy to know what's happening with that person, right? So again, self as context is usually a pretty big area of need for most people. Diffusion, this is finding that separation between the struggle and moving forward, right? This is really whenever it's just kind of like, how am I going to make this easier for myself to deal with this challenge? Am I going to add some silliness to it? Or am I going to kind of like laugh my way through it? Am I going to yell about it on a voice memo? Or am I going to journal about it? Am I going to practice some extra metaphor because I'm really kind of struggling here? Possibly. Do I need some outside assistance with that? Maybe so. So this is something else that we always have to think about too within practicing for ourselves when or practicing for others whenever kind of neglecting ourselves, is that we might need to look into some outside resources for processing ways, right? There's a mental health deficit in our world, right? So not just our field, but being able to talk to somebody about what is a useful way to work through this. Or whenever I'm feeling this stuck in this thought or in this behavior, what is something that I might be able to do? Um, and then also just accepting whenever things are challenging and how you can move forward from that. And each of these things are essentially just a stimulus or a prompt, depending on how you're using it, to make a choice or to engage in problem solving, right? Those are two very researched and evidence-based tools within the field of behavior analysis, right? Especially within the autism application. So some tools that I like to use and that are often used within ACT and that you'll see pretty frequently would be a hexaflex or this visual matrix. We're going to go through one ourselves together in at the end. And then choice point is something that Russ Harris coined. And again, it's just here's the sticky situation. I can go this way, which is towards a values-based action, or I can hook in deeper and avoid this further and notice how much further it's taking me away from my values and what I would consider values. And yeah, choice point's often a lot of people's favorite because it is just kind of like this clear, like you can do this or you can make it worse. You can do something, you can let your mind be helpful, or you can let it dictate this horrible scenario for you that's really just going to keep you further away from whatever it is that you're going to have to go through anyway to get to the other side, right? I also like to use metaphors. We have some RBTs who are fantastic and so creative with coming up with metaphors. But really, any sort of science experiment is a great metaphor. I have done a few with my kids, like my personal children, anytime that we make cookies or baking, we talk about how that's part of like practicing psychological flexibility or using ACT, right? So adding in those ingredients, but then also staying engaged in that present moment, taking sniffs of vanilla so that we're really, yeah, there we are. We're here, right? Also noticing that when we put our ingredients together, they're kind of gross to look at just themselves, but then when you mix it up, they're really, really good. And then when we go through all of these things together and we go through the hard thing of baking, that we end up having this fantastic chocolate chip cookie or whatever kind of cookie we're making after we've gone through that, right? So the perspective of like, yeah, it looks kind of gross now, but if we go through this, that's what happens. Cool. And I'm happy to share some of these resources with you too. I also apologize. There's like, I have a golden retriever and his hair is literally everywhere right now. So it just keeps like flying in front of my face. So I apologize. If you see me doing this, it's just dog hair.
Never apologize for
Um,
your dog.
he's fantastic. Oh, Georgie, where are you, baby? I don't know. He's probably taking a nap. He's spoiled. Okay. So the assessment process. We've gone through our basics of ACT. Does anybody have any questions about them or what we just talked about?
No, thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Any feedback or anything that y'all wanted to add or things that y'all like to do already?
I like the cookie one. I cook a lot with my kids, so I'm excited to utilize that.
That's a fun one. And I'll definitely make sure I'll put that in the resource folder too, so that when I share that link, you'll have that.
Thank
Because it's just a visual too. Okay, so we know this part of our task analysis of the intake. We gather as much information as we can about the learner, right? We get their medical history, we interview the caregiver, we find out what their likes and their dislikes are, usually, and this is our agency, all before we've met the learner, right? Then we have some of this happening where our behavior technician is observing and engaging and giving these little prompts while we're going a little bit deeper with the caregiver. We're going to find out a little bit more about the history. We're going to find out a little bit more of like, okay, now talk to me about what it's like in the home for you really. So when we're going to do those indirect assessments for the function or the hypothesized function, right? Or we might need to say, like, I think we're going to do the PFA on this one. Let's go through this pretty long and intense interview together. Um, so those are some of our options, right? We're still going to do that as part of the assessment process. But we're also going to start doing a little bit of a qualitative analysis, which is looking at some of these more trending factors that are coming up. What is something that's happened in the history that's come up quite a bit? So, when we're thinking about this, we're going to think about the same application with ourselves because when we're doing this, we also are going to want to make sure that what we're doing is to ourselves. So we've done all of this stuff with our caregiver. Now what we're going to do is we're going to assess how it made us feel. Okay, this is before I'm going to move forward with anything else because I've gathered some information that might make me immediately reactive or responsive to something that I think is going to be the best practice. So I want us to pause because we're all eager beavers and we all know what's best. So we're going to stop and we're going to review and examine why we were so eager to assume that that's going to be the best way to move forward. Like the caregiver's given us some basic information and we immediately are like, got it. I'm going to start an extinction protocol with functional communication training right away. Clearly, this is what this learner needs. I know best. Exactly what Rosie just said. Right, right. Because we do like, and this is to no fault of our own, to some fault of our own, and we'll talk about this in a second. No, we were conditioned this way. There was some operant conditioning that took place in our graduate programs. It's possible that it was some brainwashing, but we're all here to do better. Every single one of us who signed up for this course signed up because they were like, this doesn't feel right anymore. I need to find a different way to apply ABA or practice. Otherwise, I don't know if I'm going to stay here anymore, right? That's, I think, where ACT sometimes comes into play for a lot of people. Yeah, and in the exactly right. I can make a difference. ABA can save the world. All of these mindsets, right? These perspectives. So we're going to now try to figure out our historical perspective, our learning history. Why did we come to this realization right away that we knew what was going to be best, the best intervention? I think it's because we don't know anything else. We've been taught such limited information. We've been given such limited material that we only choose five things on a pretty regular basis because those were the five things that were just kind of thrown at us constantly and continue to be just thrown at us constantly. That's my opinion. I think it's because sometimes it's harder for us to use some critical thinking skills. I also think that historically, some of us got into the field of behavior analysis because we were seeking control in some form and in some way in our lives. So it's okay to reckon with, huh, maybe there is something there. Maybe there is a reason why at one point I thought that ABA could save the world, which isn't to say that finite stimulus control with beautiful contingencies cannot promote a healthier lifestyle and world, but ABA is not saving the world. Otherwise, it would probably already be doing that. But here we are. So we're going to accept where we are right now. Yeah, exactly. There's so many external pressures to just get it done. Part of those external pressures are from people like me, the business owner, who's saying like, hey, we need this auth done. We need to get this submitted now, right? So there's this idea of like, I'm just going to put in place these programs so that I can just get this in, right? Um, I get that. 100% I get that. But then we still are going to do this work. We're still then going to pause and we're still going to reflect and we're still going to say, why is it that I feel comfortable putting in place an extinction program for a 3-year-old for escape extinction? I'm going to kind of assess that for a second. Is it something that happened in my childhood? Was I allowed to escape demands? I wasn't. Made my bed every day and then some, just for the sake of the negative reinforcement of not having my mother yell at me. Many of us were in that circumstance. Many of us are products of the 80s and 90s. So that parenting style was not gentle. If y'all want to know what contingencies were like. So again, I would say there is some fear there, right? And so for me, a lot of times what I'll find is that I am overly corrective for many instances, and it's because I have a fear of making mistakes myself. And that comes from a lot of reflecting, but not ruminating. And so we're going to talk about how that's a little bit of a difference, right? How when we're reflecting, we're not ruminating on these past behaviors. We're using these past experiences to improve where we should go now. So that we're not then thinking like, oh man, I can't believe I did that. No, 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 no. It happened. You cannot change that. But you can say, okay, but what do I value? Okay, well, I do value this and I do value that. How can I get myself to be more in line with that value as opposed to my initial reaction, which is still going to be a struggle because ACT is a practice, just as ABA is a practice. There's not going to be a perfect progression up. It's going to have some variable data depending on setting events, depending on big challenges that are coming up, depending on new contexts. That's going to change your data. Just as it does for us, it does for our learners, right? And then we have to think about how these external variables, such as setting events, are impacting the inner behavior. That's why we were talking about emotions earlier. They matter. Why do our emotions matter? Because they're signals. And if we aren't engaged in that present moment, like what we were practicing, we have lost the connection between our mind, our body, and our current environment. If our learners are in that state as well, they are disconnected with their current environment. They're going to engage in behaviors that can get them possibly further away from their current environment, and that's where that experiential avoidance comes from. But that's also where those, what we would call challenging or maladaptive or barrier behaviors come into play. They are interfering with the learner's ability to engage in the present moment, to continue to engage in committed actions. Committed actions are simply behaviors that are in line with their values. So if we're thinking about that, we have to think about how are we promoting that and enriching that as the adults in control of the environment? How are we doing that for this learner or for these learners? We all have so many barrier behaviors that we engage in, right, Rose? And it's pretty crazy to see that we will often dismiss our own behaviors or the behaviors of adults, the adults closest to us, simply because we love them. Why can't we do the same thing for our children? No, we don't necessarily romantically love them. No, we didn't birth them, so we didn't have the same connection with them, but can't we extend that same kind of compassion towards them or that same understanding or shift our perspective to have that kind of empathy or understanding? That's what ACT is supposed to do for us, is to lend ourselves to the perspectives of our learners so that we can potentially create an environment that's more engaging, that is more values aligned, and then helps us create a life where they're going to be able to shift through context more fluently because they've been given many opportunities to engage in many different choices and ways to solve these problems. Does that make a little bit of sense? Cool. So this next thing is part of an assessment process that I love, but it's pretty complex, and this is called the PBAT. It's the process-based assessment tool. Again, I'm giving y'all a copy of this, so you'll have the article that goes along with it. The article that I have, though, is a gray paper. It has been since published, so just so you're aware. But this is something that we're going to do for ourselves here in just a little bit, which is go through like what are some negative behaviors that we have? what's a positive behavior that would be the opposite of that, right? And then we're going to talk about like what are we possibly looking at here when we're thinking about the core yearnings, which we're going to talk about here in a second, because the core yearnings, in my opinion, align really well with the functions of behavior. And I say this because usually the function tells us, okay, this is why this is happening, but this tells us why that's the function. Why is it that this learner is always doing something for attention and in a really negative way? Or like, why are they constantly seeking negative attention, right? Like those kind of reprimands. Or why do I have this learner who is constantly avoiding this specific type of demand? Like what's been shaped in their environment and in their learning history? And that can often lead us to some core yearnings. But we're going to again practice this with ourselves first, without rumination, just with reflection, so that we can create some positive behaviors or adaptive behaviors that we might want to reinforce ourselves. Cool. Okay, so this is what we get to choose every single time. We get to choose when we have these kind of dark moments take over, these challenges or these things that we would rather avoid. We have a moment to decide what's going to help lead us through it, what's going to be the strongest way, the most probable way to help us get through whatever the sticky situation is. So what we're probably going to end up, not probably, what we'll end up doing with our learners is essentially setting this up to where we can know, like, would I give this type of verbal prompt? Or when I model this type of behavior that might be shifting a perspective or singing a silly song whenever I'm presenting a demand for diffusion, or when I'm modeling like that, oh man, that stinks. Okay, that acceptance response, right? When I'm modeling these things or when I'm giving these prompts or these stimuli to engage, for the learner to engage in a response, that then I'm going to be able to kind of know, oh man, every time that I try to prompt for perspective taking or self as context, like I get zero response or the behavior escalates more. So I'm going to know that's not the way that we're going to continue to prompt this learner whenever we're in a more challenging situation, right? But instead, I'm going to look at what does work. Maybe it is engaging in a committed action. So something that the learner really does, not necessarily like what we would call reinforcing the behavior, right? Like not saying, you can have your iPad because you threw this tantrum, but maybe another activity that's equally as engaging that somebody's modeling that can then build that behavioral momentum so that then you're moving forward and able to then prompt out of that, right? So an example that with one of our kiddos, like just reading a book, like having somebody just read a book out loud is very much values aligned for this learner and is a great way to usually shift from the fused or the hooked or the challenging behavior and into something that is less of a barrier, more receptive to prompts and suggestions and problem solving and other choices. But we use it essentially as kind of behavioral momentum, right? Whereas we have another learner where if we prompt for what her values are, she shifts pretty quickly, right? So these are things that when you present these types of scenarios and these prompts, you're just going to take just kind of like this quick little frequency to know, like, okay, is this something that's going to be helpful for this learner, or is this something that historically has not worked for caregivers? And so if I try this right now, should I be prepared to have some sort of escalated response? And so this is something to think about whenever you're doing these types of assessments, is especially if you have a non-speaking learner, that you're really being intuitive with what you're presenting and thoughtful with what you're presenting, as opposed to just running through things for the sake of baseline data. Does that make sense? Cool. And we're going to go through a visual that helps with this type of assessment, like just figuring out like what is going to work best for these learners. Sorry, the sun's right there. Um, again, that just helps with data collection as well, whenever we're looking at something that's a more visual representation rather than haphazardly throwing different things at them, or not, you know what I mean. Ideas, not things. Okay, so we talked very briefly about the core yearnings whenever I brought up the PBAT, but when we think about core yearnings, there are six of them. And while there are four functions, there are six core yearnings. So I want us to think about what these are whenever we're kind of going through these assessments, especially when we talk about um, whenever we're talking about functions of behavior as well. Oh my gosh, yeah, Christine, nobody likes to be told calm down or stop or like that, but it's really counterintuitive because what ends up happening when we condition these types of demands with extinction is that we're essentially pairing coping skills with punishment. So by operant conditioning and by definition, we're making them more aversive, right? So rather than making them something that's helpful and going to again do one of our evidence-based strategies, which is build behavioral momentum, we are shutting down all reinforcement, right? When we're placing those types of demands, like first take a deep breath, then iPad. That's not conditioning taking a deep breath to the iPad. It's conditioning it to extinction, an extinction to take a deep breath, which I've had so many learners who have very much verbally expressed, do not tell me to take a deep breath. It will make things worse. And they've told me, and then they've shown me with their behavior how it makes things worse. And I think we've all been in that situation as well. Or we've had a partner who has made that very unfortunate mistake. So, joke's on them. So, when we think about core yearnings, we have six of them, as I just mentioned. We have orientation, which, right, this kind of where are we in this world? Where's our place in this world? What's my physical orientation? Where am I within the environment? I might be struggling with present moment if I feel disoriented. Coherence, so the need to be understood or the need for understanding. So I often like to think about this with some of our, forgive me for this word because I don't want anybody to come attacking me, but I think about this often with our Gestalt language process learners. Call them what you will, they communicate in a different way. There is a misunderstanding often in how they're communicating, as well as then their ability to communicate, right?
That would be amazing.
So
Do you
those
know
are
where
again
they
things that I
are
want to think about.
salary wise?
Um,
So it's
hey,
in
Adriana, I
the
think you're
18 to 20 an hour
unmuted.
range
Okay.
And
for
if you want to say
your
something that's totally
Yeah.
cool,
Yeah, we could definitely.
okay, I'm gonna mute you. Sorry. Okay, can y'all hear me again now? I hope so. Okay,
Yes.
cool. So, so when we think about coherence, right, that's understanding. And again, I think about our Gestalt language processors, the people who might communicate differently and how there might be a difference then in understanding, as well as a frustration that might build with the need to be understood. There's also then the need for competence. This might be where my need for no mistakes comes from. Several perfectionists do struggle with their core yearning for competence. And this is because you need to be that, right? You need to be competent or perceived as competent. It's part of like that deep yearning, right? The core yearning and that need. So when we think about escape maintained behavior, or we might think about attention seeking behaviors, that's why a lot of times there you might see kind of multiple functions at play, right? Somebody might choose to not engage in something at all for fear of being perceived as incompetent, right? Or somebody might do something and then do something and then do some more and then do some more to the point of complete burnout for the sake of positive attention, right? So those are things to assess and consider with competence. There's also then this need for feeling, the core yearning of feeling, the deep need for emotional connection, or the opposite of that, which is the deep need to avoid all emotion. So this core yearning of feeling can really control a lot of people's behaviors, especially when we think about the very staunch idea of that we shouldn't consider inner behavior, emotions don't matter. What are you avoiding there? Is it possible that we're avoiding some feelings? Could there be a core yearning, a need to feel potentially, if that's the case, right? So something to assess there and to really think about and consider. We all have this innate core yearning for belonging, and that is because by design, we are pack creatures. And if you didn't belong within the pack, you were not going to survive winter. So we, by evolution, have a deep desire to belong. So a lot of times when we think about, oh, that's just attention seeking, and I'm going to place that on extinction or use planned ignoring, what we're really doing is just continuing to dig deeper and fuel that yearning that much more. So it's essentially potentially doing the opposite of what our intention is, right? And this is something that we have to think about with our practices. So if we're not doing these radical assessments, oh, and I forgot one. And then there's also self-directed meaning. So with self-directed meaning, this is what am I going to do with my life? What am I supposed to do? Why am I even here? I'm in an existential crisis, right? Um, I think many of us have been there at some point in our lives. And that's when we have had to reflect upon our learning histories that much more of like, well, what am I? What are my strong suits? What's my skills-based assessment? And where should I go from here? But for many of our learners, this is a big struggle for them because they've been given what they're allowed to do, right? So there's this struggle for them personally of like, well, how far am I allowed to push? How much am I allowed to be me? Or how much am I going to have to continue to actually put a more of a mask? And is that then attributing to their ability to even assess what their true meaning is for themselves? And so again, when we do these risk benefit analyses that we're supposed to do, that many of us forget to do, this should be part of it. Well, why would this extinction procedure that I wanted to do right away after I interviewed the caregiver not be appropriate for this particular learner based on what I now know about them? These are things that we have to think about. And when we don't pause and we don't do this radical of an assessment, we're going to forget some of these things and we're possibly going to cause harm unintentionally. I'm going to put the core yearnings real quick in the chat just so that we all have them um, because I know I talk fast. So belonging again is that main one that we all have, that innate one. Self-directed meaning is the one that we were just talking about, which Rose, I love that. We've been told what they've been told what they're supposed to be, right? They've been told what they can do. They've been told, no, you can't do that quite a bit. And if they've been told no quite a bit, there's usually a reason that sometimes there's then other issues to address. So this is again why we have to look at the full radicalized history with the application of the functions of behavior and what the functions of behavior are telling us, but then also what the core yearnings might be telling us too. Feeling, orientation, competence, coherence, and no, that was it. Okay, good. That's 6. Cool. Awesome. Okay, so any questions about the core yearnings? Because I know that was a pretty brief overview. Okay, well, now we're going to have a quick application with this. So if you have just a sheet of paper, grab one if you can, and make this kind of quick chart for yourself that has the 6 core yearnings in the left-hand column, and that's the process target. And then you're going to put in another column the negative behavior. And typically, when we're talking about adults with ourselves, we're going to go into the inner behavior first. We're going to go into the thought or the negative thought or the unhelpful thought or the feeling that stands out the most. And then we're going to think of an adaptive behavior that might be a committed action, so values-based behavior that will help in that situation, be a helpful thought or feeling or action. So that's the thought process with the PBAT, is to help identify where these core yearnings come up. Because in all honesty, these come up for all of us, right? It's just like the bear scenario. In some situations, I'm going to feel perfectly competent and have no issues whatsoever with my core yearning of competence. And instead, I'm going to have more of a yearning or a need for orientation because I'm going to be very disoriented in a new city or a new public transportation system that's very disorienting. So it takes me some time to process that, right? Once I've processed it, I love public transportation as long as it's good public transportation. But that's another story. But that's again what I want us to go through now and recognizing too that I think that functional analyses, when done well, can be helpful. However, I think that we often jump to what is the most intrusive measure possible before going through less intrusive measures like this, if that makes sense. So when we're thinking about this application for a learner, we might present scenarios or contexts that would facilitate this type of disorientation, right? So if you do say, Meg, I need to know where to go from here to here using public transportation in Chicago, that's my challenge. I've not been to Chicago in 25 years. So it would take me some time to reorient myself, but you could observe what my behavior is in response to that. Do I avoid it altogether and say, no, thanks. I'm not the best person to help you with that? Am I going to engage in a behavior that might be more for attention and be like, yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else that you need to? Let me make some dinner reservations for you too. I also know this really great hotel, except that I don't because I'm lying, right? Sometimes we find ourselves in sticky situations like that because we're engaging in a behavior that we think is going to produce a certain outcome or contingency that sometimes doesn't. Our learners do the same thing. So it's important that we are looking at these behaviors with the idea of we need to look at all of these contexts as opposed to how we're always responding to the behavior. Does that make sense? So what we're doing here is presenting, sure, it's a demand context, but it's going to be pretty clear what I'm doing here, or it's going to be a very specific type of context. Because I think that we've all had learners like this where some demands they have no problem with whatsoever. Other demands, oh Lord, they're not going to do them, right? So this is one of the things that you're going to take away today as homework. You're also going to take this away, and I'm providing this for y'all today. This is the hexaflex. This is the visual matrix. The center is what we would consider the choice point. All of the other places that you could go would be the decisions that you could make. So what I like to do is take it. This is kind of a journaling activity, but it also helps a lot with figuring out where your strengths are with psychological flexibility and where you might need to go. So I love a Hexaflex too, Michael. I just think they're fantastic. And I love to use these with learners. And in the subsequent CEUs, we're going to talk about how we've used this with a lot of different learners too. But this is for an assessment process just for ourselves, again, so that we can see where we are and what we need help with too. So you're going to take kind of that sticky situation. The most recent one is usually the most effective. And go ahead and write down some things that might help you that are your values, that are some actions that you might engage in, ways that you might engage in the present moment, things that you can do or say that demonstrate acceptance, like, I got this, I can do this. Or ways that you might find some separation, like singing a silly song or sending a silly voice memo. And then what are some things that you're noticing about yourself that you can write down? Or what are some perspectives that maybe you're struggling to accept? And then what I find is that wherever you're finding the most avoidance or the most struggle to come up with ideas is typically the area that needs the most support. So if it is something where like you were like, I've got my values like this, great. You can use that most frequently then in the moment instead of being told to calm down. You can say like, oh man, it's because this goes against my values. That's why I'm struggling to accept this right now. This person was dishonest with me, and that makes me feel weird. So I have a feeling right now, and the feeling is that I didn't like it. I didn't like that there was that dishonesty because it goes against my values. Here's what I can do that's a committed action that's in alignment with my values, and suddenly I'm not so hooked anymore, right? That's just the way life goes. We get really fused with the thoughts of other people, and then we forget about how we can separate ourselves from that pretty easily. Well, not so easily, but here we've got this beautiful tool. Um, okay. And then this is what I like to use with kids. This is essentially a preference assessment. It is set, yeah, it's simple. It's not easy. That's exactly right, Rosie. And oh man, okay. Thought we were going to be right on time. We're really close though. Okay, so this is what I like to use with our kiddos. This is a preference assessment. So you've got this full free operant essentially presented, but I typically won't. So what you would do is break it down, and you're going to present however many are most appropriate for your learner, but I would say give more than two options so it's not forced choice. And then narrow it down from there. So you're going to do an MSWO, so multi-stimulus without replacement. Um, and then you're going to narrow it down. Whoops, went the wrong way. So that you're then given 1 to 5 values. And if you just start with one, which is where we are with one learner and where we've pretty much been all with this one learner, she's had one consistent value the whole time, that's fine. The rest of them might change and fluctuate. That's called a proto value or proto value. We'll talk more about that in another one when we're talking about caregiver training. But our values are supposed to change, especially when we're young and growing and developing and discovering who we are with self-directed meaning. So this is a great assessment. Again, you'll have access to this. And now it's time for y'all to practice these things. So you'll be given a hexaflex. I'm going to drop this in the chat. And you'll be given the values assessment. Practice that one yourself too. Any assessment that you're going to do with a learner, you should conduct on yourselves, right? Just so that, again, you know what you're asking and requiring of somebody. So this is the same thing. I did the VB map on myself whenever I was in grad school. I hated it. So just where we are. But do this hexaplex and do this values assessment because it's going to help you improve your practices and give something that you're going to be able to do for yourself. I can't pass the AFLs. I don't know the last time that I have like the last time that I've actually looked at the AFLs, but like one of them was like cleaning out your earring backs. Um, I've never done that and like his like since I was in the second grade and I had my ears pierced. There was something else that I was like, no, nobody does this. And the ABLES is way too long and totally specific. Agreed. Ableist. Okay, so y'all don't have to do this one. I will just make sure y'all are engaging in the present moment every now and then. Can y'all see me? Oh my gosh, I can't see you. The sun's amazing at this time of day in Colorado. Um, okay, and now here's what's up next. We're going to work on this application. You're going to write down when you're with your learner what are, based on the caregiver interview, some contexts, not just antecedents, not just conditions, but specific contexts where this behavior might occur. Now, what I'm going to do is immediately recognize that there's going to be a way that I can turn off this behavior because I have conducted that much of an analysis to know, right? That I can immediately produce this behavior as well as turn it off. But I am going to go through these very specific contexts. I'm also going to look at these behaviors that are more subtle than precursor behaviors. I'm going to start looking at what I would call hooked behaviors. And that is this kind of withdraw. the shift, the change. So this is part of that assessment process. You've got this basic understanding of what the topography of their high magnitude behavior looks like. You probably have a good understanding of what their precursor looks like, but there's usually something that happens between the stimulus and the precursor. That's what we're looking at. And so that's where we have to be behavioral detectives with our analysis and our assessment process. Okay. And then next month, we are going to be talking about metaphors. So essentially, how do we teach these concepts now for some of our learners whenever maybe they're not quite wanting us to teach these things to them, or they're maybe not verbal and they speak in a different way or communicate in a different way. So we want to make sure that what we're doing is going to be meaningful to them as well. Okay, cool. Any questions about what we talked about today?
No, thank you, but this was great.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to close. I'll leave the references up for a second, but I'm going to go ahead and just make sure I've got that folder for y'all so that you have that link right away. Okay, if somebody can click on it and let me know if they have access to it, that would be fantastic.
I
Awesome.
just requested access.
Okay, perfect. I think I can fix this right now. There. I'm sharing anyway. Okay, awesome. Yay. It looks like everybody's getting access now. And I'll make sure that that is for anybody who has the recording, I'll make sure that you'll also have the unrestricted access to it. If there's anything that I said that I would share that y'all didn't receive, please let me know, and I'm happy to just shoot it your way, as well as upload it to the folder so that there's access all around. I don't believe in gatekeeping as much as I can, which reminds me, if there's also we have a link where you signed up for this. There is free resources as well. So if you ever want just any of the articles that I've used at any CEU event or any sort of publication, I upload there. So, or at least I try to, and I try to be pretty diligent about uploading it. So feel free just to check it out and to subscribe. It doesn't cost anything. It's just, again, usually poorly named articles that I haven't like cited correctly. So, okay, perfect. It's saying the folder is empty. Oh yeah, and I'll put that in. I'll put the link in Podia, which will give y'all access to it as well. Well, that's weird. Is it still saying that if the folder's empty? Or is that just an access issue? It took a minute to load. Okay,
Empty.
there are several articles in there, so it could be. Okay, let's see here.
They all just showed up right now. Like I
Okay,
watched
it
them
did
come
take
up
some
on the
time then.
screen.
Okay, good to know. And I'm still clicking through the links real quick, so it is taking a minute, and I apologize, y'all. But I promise that I'll get those that access updated for everyone. Any other questions in the meantime? All right. Well, y'all are fantastic. Thanks again for sharing your time with me. I will say next month we will be adjusting the time to 5 p.m. Mountain Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And that's because I have a conflict. But I just wanted to let y'all know. Okay, amazing. Thanks so much for everyone's time today. Have a wonderful day.